NATO could not win a war against Russia if we fought a conventional fight today. Now, that is a really eye-opening statement that a lot of people in the West, I would venture to say most people in the West, would not believe, because it's been a conventional understanding that, well, obviously, NATO is 32 nations. Russia is just by itself. Nobody else would be fighting with them. So obviously, we would win any conflict against NATO if we fought Russia. But according to a former British Commodore, Steve Jeremy, he says that that's actually not the case, and has just written an article in Responsible Statecraft bringing this point out. First of all, Steve, welcome back to the show. We hadn't had John in a while. Looking forward to this one, though.
Yeah, no, great to be back on Daniel. I keep close track of you. You guys keep me informed, which is terrific.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and certainly glad to have you back on today. Listen, even before we get into some of the things you've talked about in this article, I'm curious, what kind of reaction have you had? Do you have people say you don't know what you're talking about? You're just, that's crazy, or do they say, "Wow, thanks for pointing that out"?
It's been, I've got nobody. There's been one or two in the chat who said it's a bit crazy, but I'm still new to X, but Ian Proud, who I think you know as well, put it out on X, and it's been a pretty positive reaction. I've had also a couple of sort of what I would call sort of insider comments from the UK, which are that you're not alone in this thinking. So I suspect I'm saying something a lot of other people have arrived at the same conclusion.
And you know, and I just wonder, and we'll keep with the UK section first. Would you look at the number of active duty ground forces, especially in the UK? It's a surprisingly small number of actual fighting formations. And to what extent does the people in the UK, and maybe this even includes like the Ministry of Defense, think about their capability that it can actually fight a war against Russia if it had to?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I'm not close to the MOD. I used to be a long time ago, but I would imagine, and I'm guessing, Danny, but I would imagine, because I'm not an insider, but I imagine they're pretty realistic about what can and cannot be done. I think we've got about, I would guess that we've got about 5 deployable brigades and a couple of a division. We'd need to work hard, I think, to deploy a division. And, you know, when you think about where Russia is with 1.5 million, we're not alone. I think the Germans are in exactly the same situation, and so too are others. So I think that's one of the fundamental points of my article, is that the only way that that if we could even envisage fighting a successful conventional war, and this is theoretical, but the only way we could envisage doing it is with the Americans all in, because I don't think it could be one otherwise.
Well, yeah, and as we're going to talk about, even the U.S. Army is more limited than many in the West, and many in the United States are even aware of. I want to just kind of preface this by, and I think you kind of alluded to it there. This would be if there was a conventional war fought between the two sides. And I think that if it actually happened, I think the chances of it going nuclear would just be astronomical, and why we should never even engage in it. But for the sake of this discussion here, we're saying that for whatever reason that the two sides recognize that nuclear war would be destructive and self-destructive to both sides, so they wouldn't go in it. So if we had to fight a conventional war, these issues are going to be very much on the table. Now, one of the first things I noticed right at the top of this article, when most people anyway think about, comparing the two sides, the first things they almost always do is look at troop size, tanks, planes, missile forces, etc. But you actually start off in a different place. You said, and Gary, if you could tell us that first call out from the article up there, you said, are we really sure NATO is up to the job of defending democratic Europe from a supposedly expansionist Russia in a doomsday scenario of a conventional NATO-Russia war? The doomsday NATO-Russia war scenario is the defining way to explore this question. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals study logistics. Our strategic analysis needs to start with way back in NATO's logistics rear areas. Why do you say you're going to start not looking at numbers of tanks and planes and whatever, however that matches up side by side, but the logistics?
Because I think that's the fundamental basis of a conventional war. I mean, as I think you've made clear, and as I would just reinforce, this is a theoretical argument, because the last thing we would want to do is to get in bed with a conventional war with Russia. It would be an appalling thing to do. But to understand NATO, and it's a very good way to think about it, but the logistics is key. I mean, for interest, I've just read a brilliant analysis of logistics in the Falklands War by an American two-star logistician. It was fantastic. But you'll be astonished just for the Falklands War about how logistics was so critical to the success in that Falklands War. It's simple things like fuel. And getting fuel to the front line, having the right amount of petrol and diesel. It's simple things like ammunition. I mean, even looking back to the Falklands War, so much of our helicopter effort was about ammunition and getting that to the right places. And of course, if you start all the way back, you've still got to get it all the way to a line of contact. Let's imagine, for example, that it's in Ukraine. I mean, there's a long way to go from factories in America, from factories in Britain, from factories in Germany, all of which will be vulnerable because, of course, in a conventional war, this isn't a war which is just constrained to Ukraine. It's a war across the whole of the NATO member forces. So you've got to think about logistics. I think the quote comes, I think, from Omar Bradley, who was on the beach at D-Day, 6th of June, I think, when he made that quote. And I think it's absolutely right because, without the right logistics, it's just a short-term thinking, really, isn't it? Because as soon as you run out, then where do you stand? I mean, let's face it, Ukraine.
And I wanted to get at least particular category, which I think you didn't mention inside the article, is that you said the production of 155 millimeter shells. As I think you've alluded to elsewhere in the article, Russia is on a full or something close to a full-on wartime industrial capacity. So they have large percentages of their GDP is focused on that kind of production, war material, et cetera. Nobody in the West is. Nobody. So they have slightly increased their capacity. I know the United States we have, but it's relatively incremental. And there's no way that cumulatively all of us have been able to even match what Russia has in a monthly production, which means that the overall disparity has grown month by month. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this to me, this is it's an example of the fact that, I mean, the first point I would make is that if we truly believe that Russia was about to go past Ukraine into Eastern and then Western Europe, we would be mobilized. And so clearly we don't believe that because we're not mobilized. But the fact is that we've reduced the size of our industrial capacity, the military industrial capacity, since the end of the Second World War, since the end of the Cold War. And at a time, we've also, I think, it's not quite so well organized. We've pushed a lot of it into the private sector. It's not necessarily, we don't necessarily get as good bangs for buck compared to the Russians, who are spending probably less than us and yet creating an army which is 1.5 million. And with all the logistics it needs. I think one of the things that we discussed in our last discussion was that one of the reasons that the casualty rates are so high in Ukraine is that they're short of ammunition, the Russians are not.
And let's look at how long it would take to mobilize those industry. I know that just from the outside looking in, it appeared that Russia, when they invaded in February of 2022, thought that they would get a shock and awe kind of situation, that with tanks rolling in from 4 or 5 different directions in the country, that the government would be shocked into making some kind of negotiated deal. And I don't think they had a plan B to continue to sustain it. Well, when the Ukraine side fought like banshees and just, these were furious and heroic and how they resisted, Russia now, all of a sudden, they don't have enough troops to actually conquer the whole country. So they have to basically try and hold on for the majority of 2022 while they ramped up their industrial capacity. It took, I would say, at least a year and a half for Russia to get to really crank it at scale in production. How long do you suppose that it would take for the West, and we'll just keep it simple at the US and UK, how long would it take us to convert our production to a wartime capacity and then be producing at scale?
That's a very good question, Danny. I would think that we're talking to 2 to 3 to 5 years, unless we really went on a full wartime mobilization. Again, we're just not used to producing these levels of ammunition at this scale. I mean, it's
and even if we did go on a full-time war mobilization, let's just hypothetically say that Russia attacks into Poland next Tuesday, and all of a sudden Article 5 kicks in, and now we're going to go to war. How long, even with that shock value, would it take to actually get to a wartime mobilization? I mean, a wartime production?
I think we'd be doing very, very well to do it in about 18 months to 2 years. So, the idea that we can just ramp this up quickly. And I think one of the points I made in the article, this isn't just about industrial capacity as well, it's about financial capacity. People talk about Russia's economy and that it's got high inflation, which is true, but it has a very low debt to GDP ratio. It's about 17%, I think. Whereas the only of one of the big countries in NATO that isn't extremely indebted is Germany. The rest of us are all with debt to GDP ratios of over 100%. So the question is, where's the money going to come from as well to actually do this industrialization? You're talking about major reductions in programs all over the rest of society, reducing healthcare, reducing all those sorts of things to achieve that sort of level of production. And I simply don't think there would be the political appetite for it.
Yeah, that is if we restricted our discussion only to those 2 points right there, that would tell you that we are nowhere near in a position where we could fight a conventional war with Russia, because they're already there. They're at production level right now in the event that they ever chose to take that course of action. But as your article continues on, that's not the only point of vulnerability. The next one here is that U.S. and NATO don't have anti-sub capabilities. One of the things you wrote about there, which I think very few people think about, is even if the U.S. Army was established at the necessary scale, and with the 2023 establishment, by the way, I think that number is actually lower today. I think it's 459 or something like that. 1/3 of the current strength of the Russian army. It is not. The overwhelming majority of American equipment and logistics would have to travel by sea. So even after we got up to this level you're talking about, and we'll say it was the best case scenario of 18 months, there they would still be vulnerable to Russian submarine-launched torpedoes and mines. As a former underwater warfare specialist, I do not believe that NATO now has the scale of anti-submarine or mine warfare forces needed to protect the Europe's sea lanes of communication. What is the capability, and I'm talking about right now, if there's a no-notice war, do we have for any submarine warfare or mine clearing capacity?
I mean, it's a very good question. The best way I can answer it is to do a comparison between toward the end of the Cold War, 1985, and where we are now. And I had a quick look at it just to sort of double check my thinking, and I was right. We're basically speaking, when we were ready to, toward the end of the Cold War, and we were very well organized. The Brits, interestingly, were probably the best at anti-submarine warfare, but the Americans were good as well. The forces that we now have compared to what we had then are a third on average. So we've got a third of the forces, and it's worth thinking that when you're doing anti-submarine warfare, it's difficult because you never know where the submarine's going to be. We do have some indications. My story on this goes back to the Falklands War. So in the Falklands War, we arrived down in the Falklands with very strong anti-submarine warfare forces, frigates. There were submarines down as well, our own submarines, lots of helicopters, and which is what I was doing. And it's astonishing how much we had to fly to hold down one conventional submarine and a 1945 Guppy class submarine, just two small, relatively unthreatening submarines for the whole of that conflict. In 1982, I would normally fly, in a very good year, in a very good month, I would fly 40 hours in a month. In May 1982, I flew 119 hours, 30. And that was the level of presence that you need to provide to actually maintain, keep the submarines' heads down, but also to see if you can intercept them if you can. I don't think we're anywhere near what we would need to do to confront a Soviet submarine threat.
And do you know off the top of your head what is the Russian submarine capacity? What are they at wartime scale?
I don't think they're at wartime scale. I'd have to double check that, Danny. But the thing about submarines is that as long as you've got enough to make things difficult, it becomes very difficult. So what we don't have is the ability to cover everywhere. In those days, we were covering 4 American supercarriers coming across at incredible speed to get off to the north coast of Norway. And we would do that in a sort of very integrated way. Now we don't have the scale to do that. So you don't need to have many submarines to get through to actually make a big difference. And it's not just about the warfighting capability, it's also about our energy infrastructure. as everybody will know, a lot of Europe has transitioned from Russian pipeline gas to LNG. And of course, how does LNG come to us? It comes to us by tanker. So you can see that there is a double vulnerability now, a vulnerability that we probably didn't have last time around.
So if in the event of a conventional conflict, you say that the submarines would not just be looking for military ships, but LNG tankers, because I mean, there's not that many. And of course, if you get into a wartime situation, there's not a lot of civilian tankers that are going to be excited about flying those waters. So, I mean, we see what happened in the Red Sea with just the Houthi strike. That just about shut that down. It's unclear, what would happen if the LNG was either curtailed or even stopped. I mean, what would that do to the European economy?
I think it would be fairly catastrophic. I mean, it's interesting as well. And if you ask me, do I think the Russians would do it? I'm absolutely certain they would, because it's exactly what they've done in Ukraine. People say they've targeted civilian infrastructure. It's not the same as, it seems to me that what they've been targeting is the energy infrastructure. And for reasons I think we discussed last time. And of course, if you take the energy infrastructure down, then you immediately take down your industrial capacity for producing weapons and munitions and those sorts of things. So, we'd be extremely vulnerable to it. And that's without even thinking about the other vulnerabilities in the energy infrastructure.
Well, that's problematic. So we have an issue with the logistics, creating them. We have logistics getting them across the ocean, but now then you also point out there's an issue with the support bases in Europe itself. As in Ukraine, Russia's ballistic campaign would also target our transport, logistics, and energy infrastructure. In 2003, while I was working for the British MOD's policy planning staffs, our post-9/11 threat analysis suggested a successful attack against an LNG terminal, such as at Milford Haven, Rotterdam, or Barcelona, would have sub-nuclear consequences. The follow-up economic shockwaves would very rapidly ripple across European continent, now increasingly dependent on LNG. What does that mean, a sub-nuclear consequence? Because that sounds really bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's something which is much larger than a £2,000 bomb. We're into, and it's probably larger than the £12,000 bomb, because when an LNG terminal goes off, the amount of released energy is huge. I mean, I think the best way you can imagine it is, do you remember that explosion in Lebanon?
I do, yeah.
3 or 4 years ago. It would be that sort of magnitude, I would guess. I can't be for sure. But there's a very big difference, because when we were looking at that, it was post 9/11, and we were thinking about terrorist attacks. And of course, we can defend against terrorist attacks, but we can't defend against hypersonic missiles, and we certainly can't defend against the Orezhnik. So there would be nothing to stop the Russians, largely speaking, wiping out our energy infrastructure.
Now, with a peacetime situation, you always want scales of economy. You want to be economic. You want to have a limited number of things, maybe larger bases. Whereas in a military economy, if you will, the idea is to spread things out and to, have multiple smaller things so that your vulnerability is lower. We're not in a wartime situation. So all of this infrastructure is in a peacetime situation, which, correct me if I'm wrong, means that there are probably a few large scale of these kinds of facilities, meaning that Russia certainly has detailed coordinates where each of these are.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with them is, as you say, they're not changing their address, so Russia knows where they are. I think from memory, the Germans have just about completed commissioning their LNG terminals now. I think they've got 1 or 2 or something like that. I can't remember it exactly, but the point is that it's taken the sort of 2 to 3 years after the start of the war to actually get this transfer complete. And there are only a few LNG terminals in Europe. I mean, the one that strikes me is Milford Haven. There's one in Rotterdam. I mentioned Barcelona as well, but you'll probably find there's 5 to 10 LNG terminals in the whole of Europe. So, wow, that's a very easy target for
huge vulnerability.
Yeah.
Let's look real quick at the opposite side of that equation, because certainly we would do the same thing to Russia were they to attack us. Do you have any knowledge about how many of these facilities they have and how effective we would be at targeting theirs?
I don't have any knowledge of it. Of course, they are energy exporters, so it's not quite so relevant to them. They have their own energy infrastructure, so they don't need to import. Indeed, they export both gas and oil. So they're energy exporters. So for them, I think it's a different issue. But the key point is that, at the moment, as far as I understand, and you may know better, or Ted Bosnis may know better, we don't have a hypersonic capability. So for at least, I would think, the next 2 to 3 years, then there's no chance of us being able to respond in kind, and certainly not with anything like the Rezhnik, which, as far as I can see, it's almost indefensible. But when I was in a NATO force, I was the captain of an air defense destroyer, so I do know a little bit about air defense. And looking at the Rezhnik, I can't imagine us having an ability to counter it for at least 5 years, if indeed possible at all.
What's ironic, if not outright perverse, about that is that when the United States got out of the ABM treaty, which now legally opened the gates for Russia to start working on an intermediate range missile, which turned out to be the Rezhnik, we didn't. We got out of it, but we didn't develop the missile. We did nothing. And now that, as you say, we're probably in the best case scenario 4 to 5 years behind. That's not a good thing.
Yeah.
Let's see. All right. So that was the support bases. One other thing is, which, golly, I mean, these things just keep adding up and they're all compounding. Let's say that somehow we figured out how to get rid of the logistics problems and the navigation in the seas of the LNG terminals, and we still were able to bring force, enough troops to bear to actually have a good fight. Then you say that we're still in the pre-drone doctrine, perhaps more contemporarily important. Other than a handful of NATO trainers forward deployed in Ukraine, our forces are trained according to a pre-drone maneuver doctrine and have no real-world experience of modern peer-to-peer attritional warfighting, whereas the Russian army has close to 3 years experience now and is unarguably the world's most battle-hardened. How important is this from a military perspective that our troops, really the most I guess you would have to go back to maybe the 2003 Iraq War in the U.S., where we had still maneuver warfare and tank-on-tank kind of stuff, or my experience in Desert Storm, the Battle of 7-3 Easting. But since that time, the only thing we have are small skirmishes against the Taliban or insurgents in Iraq, et cetera. And I'm talking across the board here. How important is that? Because we've been doing training exercises, certainly, on modern stuff. But what would be the difference when those forces clash the first time?
Well, I think they'd be pretty catastrophic, actually. I mean, it's not to say that you can't train for these sort of things. You can, but it's one thing training for it. It's quite another thing fighting. And, we went into the Falklands War, I say this, exceptionally well trained, but we still learned a hell of a lot. And we made some mistakes, and we lost ships that, looking back, we probably shouldn't have done, but that was just the way it was. There's no substitute, as you will know very, very well indeed from 73 Eastings. There's no substitute for actual combat expertise, and the people who fought in the Falklands War in the Navy brought that expertise all back, and we probably retained it, I should think, for about between 10 and 20 years in damage control and all of these issue areas. But there is no substitute for combat expertise, and so I think we'd get a pretty bloody nose even if we survived it. And that assumes as well that we in the West would be prepared to take the levels of casualties that we're seeing in peer-to-peer warfighting between Ukraine and Russia. I think there's very little appetite for that sort of level of casualties.
Well, that's certainly true. And in fact, I see one of our viewers here said, Iraq was not a war. And I do think that's important to point out, not just to be whatever it be, pointing any bad fingers. But I mean, I can say, I think the last really big one was going all the way back to Desert Storm, where I was with the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Squadron, and we fought tank-on-tank battles. I mean, that was really much more difficult than the 2003 Iraq War, because they had 10 full years of sanctions on them prior to that and had been attrited out. But at that time, they were still at their full strength. And I can just tell you, we went against them. Basically, they had no Air Force and no Navy. And so their capacity to shoot back, their training was very poor, et cetera. So it wasn't a peer-to-peer. It wasn't even a near peer-to-peer. Anything that what you're talking about here will be a peer-to-peer, not a near peer, but a peer. And with a Navy, with Air Force, with drones, with air defense systems, with all these kinds of things, and trained and experienced troops. That's something that no one in the entire West has the mentality to understand what that even is like. And I think that is a bigger issue than most people realize in the West.
Yeah. I mean, I think General Cavioli's actually talked sort of tangentially on this and saying that the level of fighting that's going on in between the Russians and the Ukrainians is like something that people in the West haven't seen for as long back as you say, Danny. And I think, of course, when you throw in drones and the way that's changing the battlefield feels to me almost a little bit more like offshore. Because in offshore, we were always extremely cautious about MCON. Emission control was critical, and giving away your position was critical. So many of the things that I now see in land warfare were things that we had experienced and struggled with in sea warfare and indeed in the air.
I want to shift gears a little bit here. So basically what through your article, you've painted a picture that says the entire Western alliance is not, quote, the greatest military in the history of the world, as our previous president had claimed that we were, but that we have some significant vulnerabilities at virtually every stage of the way here. So we've talked about you said at the beginning of this episode here that this is a theoretical kind of situation. Well, if it turns into more of an actual situation, then we should be aware of our vulnerabilities, which should also inform how our politicians approach this and whether we would be willing to get into a fight should we have the opportunity. I think that the nearest point to where this could actually be tested is in the Baltics. And there was a 2016, a lot of people were shocked in the United States in 2016 when I believe it was Foreign Policy came out with a big headline. It said that if the NATO and the Russians went to war in the Baltics, the NATO would lose and lose quickly, as it pointed out there. This was from a RAND study that had looked at the situation and war gamed out what might happen, and their results were quite shocking. And in fact, I want to show you something from 2017 where the RAND people themselves addressed just how this outcome was projected.
Russia's annexation of Crimea signaled Moscow's willingness to use force to alter the existing European security order. In the wake of this action, RAND asked, could a newly assertive Russia become a military threat to NATO? For the past 3 years, we've conducted a series of war games examining the outcomes of a possible Russian attack on the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The results are unambiguous. NATO is completely unprepared to defend these member states against the prospect of Russian aggression. The key finding of this work is that a Russian conventional attack on the Baltic states would result in a catastrophic and decisive tactical defeat for NATO in 36 to 60 hours, with the Russians at the gates of the Estonian capital of Tallinn and the Latvian capital of Riga.
Now, that is shocking because that war game was done when both the Russian side and the NATO side, neither one of them had any experience, because obviously this is before the Russia-Ukraine war had started. So that was with 2 near peers that were fighting, both fresh, and drones weren't part of that equation there, at least not in any major way here. But now then the situation is radically different because, as you said just a second ago, Russia now has 3 years of war at high intensity levels. They have suffered a huge number of casualties, and they have been quite hardened in the lessons that they have learned, and they have made tremendous changes in their doctrinal approach. But as you said earlier, we're still in the pre-drone mentality. How can we reverse this or fix this problem, and how serious is it?
I think it's really serious, Danny. And I think the problem is that as with all the vulnerabilities that I talked about, if we work hard to try and reverse them, then that will be obvious to Russia. And my suspicion is that they'll outperform us, and indeed they're already talking in this way. That they're bound to respond if we appear to be seeking to sort of rebalance things, because they see us as the threat. I think. I mean, I hadn't seen the RAND study, but it doesn't surprise me at all. I was in Standing NATO Force Mediterranean, amongst other places. We were in the Baltic for what we'll call BALTOPS, but that included a visit to Latvia. Lovely people in Latvia, but the scale of the armed forces is minuscule, and I think they had 1 or 2 minesweepers, something like that. That was about it. And I think one of the interesting things here, which is slightly off the subject, but probably for a shortly conversation, is that the states like Latvia and Estonia were, of course, delighted to come into NATO because they have this issue of having the big bear on their border. But the problem with that is that if they come into NATO, there's a big question, which I had as soon as they were coming in, which would I want to, if I found, let's say, Estonia or Latvia was being noisy with Russia or sort of suppressing I think Latvians have a third of their people are Russian, as in Ukraine, so they're Russian, ethnic Russians. If the Latvians started to suppress them in the same way that the Ukrainians did, and the Russians decided to take action against Latvia, would I want to spill British blood to support them in what seemed to me to be a not very clever thing to do? Would we want to spend American blood? And that, of course, takes you to what is, I think, is key flaw in NATO, which is that the danger is that people will assume, or many will assume, that because they're in NATO, they've now got America on their side. And of course, that might not be the case. Article 5 doesn't necessarily mean everybody will jump in. So I think that what NATO has done in a way has made some of these smaller states more noisy in a way which is unhelpful. I think we've seen the ex-prime minister, I think, of Estonia, who's now the foreign minister of the European Union, being extremely anti-Russian. And this coming from a small state, which you would think as I think you said before, that they're not going to change address. So if you've got a big state and you're next to a small state, then you probably want to be a little bit careful, as I suspect Mexico is finding at the moment.
Well, yeah, that is exactly the case. And I wanted to actually show, because there's actually a video that was just out today of something that actually happened in August of last year, at the end of last summer. Elon Musk addressed the cadets at West Point, and he talked about where the future of war is going in terms of drones. And as we've discovered, really, the future is already here. But here, watch what he has to say.
Drones are going to be overwhelmingly what matters. It'll actually be, I think, probably too dangerous to have humans at the front. It's drones at the front.
It's too dangerous.
Drones don't miss.
Because of the lethality, then. It's
Yes.
too dangerous to have humans at the front.
If you've seen some of the computer-controlled sniper rifles, I mean, they just don't miss. So you're fighting a machine that's gonna, aim with micron level accuracy, and never gets tired.
Now, we're actually going to do a show this afternoon on breaking down a lot of the things that he said in there. But he raised a big point that it is quote, too dangerous on the front for people. And we've interviewed people for this show on both sides of the line in the Russia-Ukraine war, both on the Ukraine and the Russian side, who both talk about the pervasive nature of the drones and how very, very difficult it makes life. Those are for the guys who are fighting it right now. But I ask you, Commodore, what is your understanding from your current connections? We'll just keep it in the UK. How do you think mentally they're prepared to fight the same kind of fight with the drone warfare?
Again, I'm not close to Army and Marine colleagues at the moment, just I work in a different sector. But I think that it feels to me a bit like the sort of the turn of the century. At the turn of the century, we had something which was called network-centric warfare. What that meant was gluing us all together with computers so that we get much better situational awareness, and that you could call for fires, and that you'd be using essentially what is a sophisticated internet to actually do fires with a variety of different weapons. I think it's a bit like that, but much more intense. I mean, I think there are questions about drones. I mean, you can't use drones at great range. They're slow. But equally, they have undoubtedly made a big difference. And I think this is one still for us to sort of work our way through. I mean, when this war eventually comes to an end, and hopefully sooner rather than later, I think there'll be a lot of scratching of heads and thinking about how we do this. I mean, there are already questions, I mean, it goes not just from drones, it goes all the way up to fast jets. and the question about whether manned aircraft will be the thing of the future. And it's as a naval aviator, it's a very difficult question to answer. I suspect that over time it probably will. We probably will see a lot of replacement of things like fast jets. Equally, though, there is an issue, which is how do you control these things? And at some stage, there is going to be some sort of communications, not vulnerability, but an area without the communications that you can't use these things. So again, it's going to be a sort of cut and thrust as one side gets no more of than another side. And we seen things like the drones, which are fiber driven, which are almost impossible to keep.
That's actually what we're going to talk about in the next episode. There, the fiber optic cable ones, which are impervious to electronic warfare, and as Elon Musk talks about, the AI driven at the tactical level. So once they get up in the air, you don't even have control over them anymore, and that's another level of concern that we can have. And in fact, I wanted to kind of ask you as an aside here, especially from the naval area. In the beginning of this war, there was a big issue with the Russian Black Sea Fleet and the fact that Ukraine basically had no navy. And yet, with many cases with some missiles, but also with naval drones, they were effectively able to drive the whole Black Sea Fleet way farther to the east. And so it's out of Sevastopol and some of these other places. How important do you see the development of drones for naval warfare? And has naval warfare changed and we just don't know it yet?
I think it's changing. I think the main thing is that it will drive navies further offshore because it's not easy. You don't want to be close to shore because at least if you've got distance, then you've got the time to detect things and then defend yourself against them. So in the old days, it used to be 3 to 5 miles. Not a good idea to actually take ships too close if you hadn't suppressed forces. But now I don't know what the lessons learned so far are in the Red Sea, but I would imagine one of them will be that we need to be further offshore. I imagine the other one will be also that it's expensive to defend ourselves against these things. You're using highly costly missiles, which were really used to defend against other missiles against much cheaper drones. So the cost comparison is not good. So I think it will push navies further offshore. It's easier to deal with offshore because, of course, you do have a clearer airspace and a clearer radar space, so you can see these things much less so than onshore. But it's bound to have an effect. Difficult to say though, more than push us offshore and constraining our operations.
Yeah, we may want to have you back on. We just talk about the future of naval warfare on a future episode. I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Yeah.
One of the next things I wanted to talk about here, again, on the theme of how realistic is a possible clash between NATO and Russia, especially in the Baltics, because as this clip here from Deutsche Welle shows, the Baltics are a lot more vulnerable, even tactically, than one might appear.
It is often described as NATO's Achilles heel, a strip of sparsely populated land stretching some 65 kilometers on the border between the NATO states Poland and Lithuania. The Suwalki Gap is a challenge for NATO to defend. The strip connects the Russian exclave Kaliningrad with Belarus. If Russia and Belarus were ever to invade and close that gap, NATO members Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they would be cut off from allies to the south.
Now, that's really important because that's the geography of military. We've been talking about the fundamentals of the battle and all the logistics and everything to go along with that. But in the event that Russia decided they were going to take the risk of trying to take the Baltics, they would seem to have a lot better chance. And again, this is going back to the 2016 scenario where we said, some of our best analysts, that they could take it in 96 hours. Today, it seems like it could be a lot higher. And as you see on the screen there, this is from RIA Novosti. This is from a Russian channel, or a Russian media rather. And I've seen these kinds of comments on several Russian military review, some Telegram channels, that there are a number of voices, how influential they are to Putin, which is the only one that really matters over there. We don't know, but there is a lot of talk that says if these negotiations that are about to start between Trump and Putin don't reach a satisfactory ending to the Russian side, that they have the military wherewithal to just keep fighting. And their claim is that if they're forced to fight all the way up to, say, to the Dnieper River, up to the gates of Kiev, that they're going to not just solve that part of the border, but then they're going to shift up north, possibly with Belarus, and they're going to close that whole thing off and seal off all of the NATO threat from their border. Now, whether they would do it or not, I don't know. But the fact is they're thinking about it. And I think that you've just laid out a pretty convincing plan that if they chose to do that conventionally, that it's not likely we'd be able to stop them. Do you see it any differently?
No, I don't. I think that the RAND study on the Baltic is on the money, and as you say, it's going to be even worse. I think when it comes to Ukraine, I've got a strong sense that the Russians will do what they plan to do, and we have one or two questions. I hear so many people saying, "Oh, Putin's going to do this, he's going to do the other." Everybody who says that is guessing. That they don't know, and it's sad to hear them sort of be so opinionated that they think that they can get inside his mind. I find him, looking at him, you have to respect him, because I think he's extremely strategic. And I think that, to me, I think the issue is Russia will want to achieve its objectives. The key objective is to make sure that it feels safe from NATO forces. And I said as far back as 2022 in the article, which I think you've seen from the Naval Review, that my guess would be that the question was, once he had secured the Donbass, or the Russians had secured the Donbass, where would they feel would give them the best strategic depth? And it seemed to me that the answer would be to go to the Dnieper River, which for good land warfare reasons. And the open question I still have is whether or not that he would also want to secure Odessa as far as Transnistria. And I think my guess is that he probably would, given the opportunity. The reason being that essentially it will mean that there is no longer a maritime threat with Odessa and the Ukraine coastline gone, and so that all they have to worry about is what would essentially be a rump Ukraine. So, but that is still an open question. So I think that's if the Russians or if the peacekeeping doesn't work or the peace negotiations don't work, I think they will keep going until they're in a position where they feel secure and they feel they've achieved their objectives. And I think they're en route to do that. I don't think there really is much that we can do to stop them without NATO wading into this in much higher level. And I can't see us doing it. There's no political appetite in any NATO country for us to do that.
And what do you say to those people who say, well, but the Russians can't do that? Yeah, they'd like to. Look, it took them 3 years just to get this 20% or 22, whatever the number is today. And to be able to go all the way to the Dnieper is just, it's almost double that distance that they've taken. And, unless they want to fight another 3 years, they can. So, Putin has motivation, and Trump can use that as leverage against him. What do you say to that argument?
I think those people don't understand strategy and operations. And the reason I say that is that they're assuming that the slow speed of Russian advance is due to some sort of incompetence or difficulty. I think it's completely different. I mean, I think as the Russians did the tactical withdrawal in 2022, it seemed to me that at that stage they'd realised that this is going to be more difficult than expected. They withdrew to a heavily defended line, and of course then the next phase was an attritional strategy, and the West, or the Ukrainians, actually lost not one but two and arguably three armies against that war. I mean, I happen to think that the reason that the Russians are not taking back Kursk quickly may well be that they've actually made a tactical decision and decided to themselves, well, if the Ukrainians want to throw war fighting forces into this cauldron, then so be it. We're trying to actually demilitarize them, and if they want to help us in that, then so be it. That will actually draw forces away from the main fronts, which are on the south and the middle of Ukraine, and allow us to achieve the things that we want to do.
So I actually read a report this morning by an analyst here in the United States that basically scoffed at the Russians, saying that, after 6 months and now a day, they still haven't been able to take back the Kursk salient. Yeah. But you're suggesting that maybe they didn't want to, because all this time Ukraine has been feeding unit after unit into that cauldron, which poses no threat to the Russians at all. but it sure is chewing up a lot of bodies for the Ukraine side.
Yeah, absolutely. In a way, it's a sort of, I mean, I think it was a really poorly thought through and a poorly designed operation. I'm sure it was done for political and sort of negotiative reasons. And there was thoughts that it was to take a nuclear power station, of course. But again, Putin is an extremely strategic person, and people underestimate him at their peril, as we have done. And I just have a sense that this may be the reason that they're not taking it back more quickly. I mean, if you look at the salient, it's surely, you will know this better than me, Danny, but it's surely not that difficult to come across the neck of the salient and cut them off. But why not wait? You know, if they're preparing to throw people in and you've got overwhelming air power, then why wouldn't you do that? I mean, it's very sad for the Ukrainians who are being committed to that, because it's, for many of them, it'll be a one-way trip, and probably for most of them. But actually, for the Russians to achieve their military objectives, it probably suits them. It's firstly, you're attriting a fair bit of force, and also you're drawing them away from probably what are much more important areas.
Yep, up in the Donbass for sure. So, what do you think? What do you think the West could do to minimize these vulnerabilities, and at every stage, from the industrial capacity to the sea protection, the sea lanes of communication for capacity, and the doctrine, the training? Can these situations be reversed? And what would you recommend if the president and the prime minister were asking you?
Yeah, good question. I think we could, and I talk about this a little bit in the article. I think we could seek to to address these vulnerabilities, and some of them we certainly should. I mean, not being able to actually protect our sea lines of communication for somewhere like Europe, where we're critically dependent on them, we certainly should have a look at. But I think that whatever we try to do to confront these vulnerabilities, we're probably, if we do it in a way where we're working in a confrontational way against Russia, then Russia will respond. And I suspect that they'll out respond us, if you see what I mean. Because they're already mobilized, we're not. And I don't see where the money and the political will comes to do that. So that then takes you to the fundamental question of the article, which wasn't explicitly discussed. But what value NATO? We know that the Americans are already asking that question, but there's a question for the Europeans to ask as well. I think I say in the article that if you look at NATO's track record in Kosovo, I think I said in the article that it was a score draw. I think that's probably not the right approach, because really when you look at Kosovo, what we were doing with NATO forces in Kosovo was exactly the same logic as what Russia was doing with its forces in the Donbass. And we were using Article 51 from memory without a UN security resolution. And essentially a war which was breaking out, defeating Serbia, so that the Kosovans would have their own place to live. And you could say that, well, it's exactly the same logic that was used in Ukraine in the special military operation. But if you look further, you go further on to Afghanistan, where you and I were both involved. I mean, we used to joke in Standing NATO Force Mediterranean that NATO stood for no ability to organize, and that certainly was the case in Afghanistan. It was a very badly organized operation, I'm sad to say. And now look at us. So I think the question is, is NATO past its sell-by date? You'll guess what I think is the answer to that.
But I think you can guess I'm in agreement with you.
Yeah, I think this is a fundamental issue as well, because what's the major... if you look at the Russia-Ukraine war, it's very easy to say what we need to bring this to a peace. We need to stop the war. But to me, that's treating the symptom and not the cause. And to me, the cause, I think, is a NATO which has been aggressively expanding right up to the borders of Russia. And yet, I think I say in the article, in fact, I've got it just in front of me, I said that the article, in truth, is that NATO now exists to confront the threats created by its continuing existence. Yet, as our scenario shows, NATO does not have the capacity to defeat the primary threats that its continuing existence has created. So, there must be questions about NATO. And I think any peace discussions which don't at least have a look at the future and the future security architecture of Europe and what we want for a sustainable peace do not look at NATO are simply going to treat the symptom of this situation rather than the cause.
And by the way, I want to mention to everybody that article is linked in the description of this video. So if you want to read it, by all means, click on that and go there. Last question I want to ask you, which is a little bit scary. If for whatever reason, it doesn't matter what it turns out to be, but in the event that Russia decides that its security is necessary to cut off the Baltics from NATO, and they actually move militarily and take that, do you think that, because Article 5 would immediately be called into play, of course, I mean, automatically by the Baltics themselves, do you think that London, Washington, Paris, Rome would be willing to risk nuclear exchange with Russia over the Baltics?
No, short answer. I'm about as certain I can be. I think the other interesting part of that question would they be willing to risk conventional war against Russia? Because what we're talking about in that situation, let's assume that the Russians have done what the RAND study correctly predicts. We're talking about taking back those states. And I can't imagine us, even if we could do that, I mean, as soon as we start to mass the forces to take them back, then the conventional situation, the conventional warfighting situation that I've analyzed suddenly comes to the fore, and we find that we can't do it. So I think that I would like to think that the military advice to the politicians from the senior military officers in the West is that we will not be able to do this. But I don't see any appetite in Russia to do this. There's nothing in what the Russians have said, and I think it's something that they wouldn't want to do unless there was some sort of some reason for them to do it, which we had created. So I'd like to think that wouldn't happen. But the truth is that I think the chances of us taking back those states with Russia ensconced in them is near zero.
Near zero. Yeah, that's my assessment as well.
Yeah.
And that really then the net bottom line of all this is, if you're a Western politicians, we need to change our diplomatic mentality and how we define security, because so far it has been exclusively how much military can we have. Mark Rutte just days ago said, yes, we need to prevent war. We need to spend more. Everything is on making military more capable, et cetera. No thought to actually having a better security architecture that can keep everybody safe and out of war, because I believe that is far more possible than to try and out military the Russians. How do you see it?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. What we've been doing, Danny, is under the heading collective security, which is what NATO are about. We've actually been engaged in confrontational security, and very much seen in a zero-sum game, which is that we because of our dominant force after the end of the Cold War, we're able to do this, and we don't really care what Russia thinks. I think we've shown now that wasn't successful. What the Ukraine war shows more than anything else is that NATO didn't work. So I think now we've got to start thinking about collaborative security, and eventually, perhaps with time, getting to common security, because at the moment confrontational security has failed, and anybody who thinks that we can sort of ramp up or double down, if you like, on confrontational security is just going to lead to an arms race, which will look like the Cold War all over again, but on steroids.
Yeah, and they could always lead to a hot war, which would be catastrophic.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we really appreciate you coming on today. This has been very, very illuminating. It's, I guess, controversial in the sense that it is a shock to the minds of most people in the West who have no idea about this, because we've been led to believe from the beginning that NATO is the most powerful military alliance in history, et cetera, and obviously we're stronger. So there's very few people who have ever even thought about some of the specific things you lay out here, and they're very difficult to argue with. So I hope, if nothing else, we have opened the minds of people to start thinking about some things in a different way.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, Danny, and thank you again for all the work you do. It's invaluable to people like me over in the other side of the Atlantic.
Well, thank you very much, of course. And also to remind everybody, at 3 o'clock this afternoon, we're going to talk about, speaking of the future of warfare, the future of warfare with Elon Musk. And that he said a number of very interesting things there. And he also illuminated some things just like Commodore here just did. So you're not going to want to miss that one. I promise you. 3 o'clock today, Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We'll see you then.